flight attendant slides her key into room 237, but someone's already inside. 5 minutes later, she's gone, and her killer vanishes for 11 years. In February of 1991, a brutal murder at a Detroit airport hotel shocked investigators and left them with more questions than answers. Little did anyone know it was connected to another heinous homicide just 5 years earlier. The story of how these two crimes, seemingly unrelated in time and place, were solved a decade later is a testament to persistence and the power of evolving forensic science. On the night of February 17th, 1991, 41-year-old Nancy Jean Ludwig arrived in Romulus, Michigan after a long transcontinental flight. A seasoned flight attendant, Nancy was based in Minnesota, specifically in the suburb of Minnetonka, where she lived with her husband, Art. She was no stranger to overnight layovers. In fact, she hadn't even been scheduled originally to work this day. She was a last-minute substitute, volunteering to cover the flight to help out a colleague. As an experienced crew member, Nancy handled the change in schedule with her usual professionalism. She probably only thought about getting some rest before her next assignment. The February air was bitterly cold as she stepped off the crew shuttle van and walked toward the hotel that Northwest Airlines put up its staff in. She'd stayed at the airport Hilton countless times before. Everything seemed normal to her today. Inside the warmly lit lobby, business travelers and airline crews milled about, weary from their journeys. Nancy checked in around 9 p.m., collected her room key, and headed to the elevator. She rode up to the third floor and walked down the corridor to room 237. For Nancy, there was no reason to suspect anything was amiss. This was just another hotel stay, in a familiar place, after a tiring workday. She swiped her key and pushed open the door, expecting darkness, and an empty room where she could finally unwind. But unfortunately, what awaited Nancy in the darkened hotel room wasn't peace, but it was a predator. The moment Nancy stepped inside, she was attacked, almost instantly. Somewhere inside the dark room, a man had been lying in wait, who'd gained entry before she arrived. Nancy barely had a chance to react or even cry out. The assault was swift and vicious, suggesting the killer had subdued her by surprise and probably by overwhelming force. Nancy's hands were tied with twine, and her mouth was gagged to stifle any screams. The attacker then essayed her. Afterward, the violence escalated further. The man produced a blade and slashed Nancy's throat with such ferocity that it nearly decapitated her. In addition to the fatal throat wound, Nancy suffered multiple stab wounds and cuts. The ferocity of the attack even left defensive wounds on her hands, indicating that she tried to fight back at some point. The scene was nothing short of horrific. A sudden blitz attack, followed by torture, and then a lethal wound. In the immediate aftermath, the killer exhibited an eerie calmness. Rather than fleeing in panic, he stayed in the room for some time to methodically clean up. Reports indicate that he turned on the news and took a shower. He even used the hotel towels and washcloths to dry himself and to attempt to remove evidence. He seemed careful to avoid leaving clear fingerprints on surfaces, probably by wearing gloves and wiping things down, because later investigators would find no usable prints on the door, fixtures, or furniture. It was as if the murderer had done this before, practicing how to leave a crime scene as sterile as possible. When he finally slipped out of room 237, he took all of Nancy's luggage with him. Incredibly, no witnesses on the floor reported hearing a disturbance, including another flight attendant who was sleeping in the next room over. The killer then apparently walked out of the hotel, loaded the luggage in his car, and drove away. Nancy Ludwig's body wasn't discovered until the next day, Monday, February 18th of 91. Because Nancy was a last-minute crew substitution, she wasn't on the airline's official roster for the outbound flight that morning. So when she failed to show up in the lobby to catch the crew transport, no immediate alarm was raised. Colleagues simply didn't realize Nancy was missing. It wasn't until 1 p.m. that afternoon when a housekeeper knocked on the door of room 237 and let herself in to clean what was assumed to be an empty room. But the gruesome sight that greeted her probably haunted her for years. Panicked hotel staff called the authorities, and soon detectives from the local police and Wayne County Homicide Unit swarmed into the room. Seasoned investigators were shaken by the brutality of the scene. Blood soaked the sheets and splattered the walls, but they made sure to take notes that parts of the room were unnaturally clean, as if the killer had attempted to erase his presence. The very notion that someone could commit such a heinous act and then calmly clean up afterward, all without anyone noticing, was chilling. Forensic technicians combed the room and bathroom for fingerprints, stray hairs, fibers, or any personal items the perpetrator might have left behind. They collected samples of bodily fluids, hopeful that one day DNA testing might identify the killer. Recall that the first case that was officially solved with DNA had only taken place just 4 years prior to this, in 1987, so the science was still young. The crime lab did manage to develop a DNA profile, but at that time it could only be compared against Michigan's own DNA records, and unfortunately there was no match found in the state system. Other aspects also perplexed the police. There was no sign of forced entry into room 237. Given the violence of the attack, it seemed unlikely that Nancy willingly opened the door to a stranger late at night. That pointed to the probability that the murderer had a key card. Early suspicions were that perhaps the assailant was someone who worked at the hotel or frequented it. Detectives questioned hotel staff and management exhaustively. They also pulled the electronic keycard logs, which in theory record every single use of a key to enter a room. But strangely, the logs provided no clear answers. There was no record of an unauthorized key entry. There are only two probable explanations. The killer had used a stolen master key, which wouldn't necessarily show up like a regular guest key, or he jimmied the lock somehow. This puzzle added to the investigators' belief that the crime was premeditated and executed with cunning. Another clue that supported premeditation was the twine that was used to bind Nancy. The common gardening twine stood out in a hotel room. It was something the killer had to have brought with him. Unfortunately, though, it was easily obtainable, and at the time didn't give the investigators any leads, but let's remember this detail for later. Security footage from the hotel's entrances and lobby was also reviewed. In 1991, surveillance cameras were not as ubiquitous or high resolution as they are today, and if hotels happened to have any at all, they were likely to be grainy VHS recordings. Police couldn't definitively identify anyone suspicious coming or going around the time of Nancy's murder. However, several witnesses came forward when they heard about the murder to share a possible clue. They worked for the airline, and they remembered seeing a man in his 20s loading airline-issued luggage into a gold Monte Carlo the night before. At the time, it had been just odd enough to catch their attention. Police quickly brought in a sketch artist. Several sketches were published in the Detroit Free Press as well. Unfortunately, with no license plate or clear image of the driver, that clue went cold, but it too would resurface later. A vicious murder of a flight attendant in a busy airport hotel was front page news, and as such, you might expect that there'd be a quick break in the case. But despite a flurry of initial investigation, leads quickly dried up. The perpetrator appeared to be a phantom. He left behind his DNA, along with the brutality of his actions, but there was little else that pointed to his identity. To Nancy's grieving husband, Art Ludwig, it was unthinkable that someone could do such evil and just simply disappear. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, that's exactly what happened. By the mid-1990s, Nancy's murder seemed destined to remain an unsolved nightmare. The file was shelved, evidence stored carefully in a property room, awaiting information or technology that wasn't yet available. But there is one more tip that bears mentioning. Really, it was something more of a hunch that was reported to the police. A man named Mark Eby was convinced that this wasn't the murderer's first time killing. Mark had seen accounts of Nancy's murder in the news, and the hotel scene, as it was described, sounded incredibly familiar to him. 5 years before, Mark had experienced his own tragedy. His mother had been murdered in their own home under very similar circumstances. Now, I don't know how closely detectives looked into this man's hunch at the time. Maybe they looked into it, or maybe they completely ignored it as the figment of a grieving man's imagination. But either way, it would take many more years before this link was confirmed. Nearly 70 miles away, and 5 years earlier, on November 9th of '86, Dr. Margaret Eby, a 55-year-old music professor and respected academic, was found dead in her home in Flint, Michigan. Margaret was a well-known and admired figure in the community, educated, accomplished, and beloved by her family and colleagues. The local newspaper, the Flint Journal, had been sprinkled with mentions of her because she'd spearheaded a 6-month-long arts festival in 1985 to celebrate the composer Johann Sebastian Bach's 300th birthday, the basically Bach Festival, which even brought Flint some worldwide notice. Margaret lived alone in the gatehouse located on the Applewood estate, the sprawling home of a wealthy philanthropist family, the Mott family. The estate was secluded and upscale, not the sort of place one would expect a violent crime to occur. In fact, today the estate is a museum that's open to the public. But things were far from idyllic on that November 9th. It was Sunday afternoon when a friend, John Hyde, stopped by to collect some of Margaret's prized geraniums that he'd agreed to store over the winter. When he arrived, he was surprised to find the front door open, so he politely shut it and knocked. But when Margaret didn't come to the door, he just assumed she was napping and went about digging up the geraniums, expecting that she'd come out at any time. After storing the geraniums in his car, though, he started to get concerned. By this point, another friend had arrived. So after a short conversation, the two decided that somebody needed to check on Margaret. So when their knocks again went unanswered, they cautiously opened the door. There was no sign of her on the first floor, so one of the men went upstairs, calling her name as he went along. The silence was deafening. Sadly, the scene he found bore an eerie resemblance to what would later be found in Nancy Ludwig's hotel room. Margaret had been murdered in her own bedroom. She was nude from the waist down, indicating that she'd been SA'd, and her throat had been viciously cut. In fact, Ebby's neck wound was so severe, she was nearly decapitated, just like Nancy. Blood covered the bedroom floors and walls. The killer apparently spent time cleaning up after himself here as well. Later, investigators would note blood in the sink and bathtub, suggesting that the perpetrator had washed his hands or body. A towel bearing traces of DNA was left on the bathroom floor. It was a ghastly and perplexing crime. Who would target a dignified professor in her own home? Flint Police and Michigan State Police investigators launched an intensive investigation. They quickly discovered a single fingerprint, smeared in blood, on a surface in the bathroom. This fingerprint did not belong to the victim, so it was almost certainly left by the killer. In 1986, fingerprint analysis was a well-established forensic tool, and the print was carefully lifted and cataloged. Police ran the print through Michigan State Police fingerprint records, but no matches turned up. Even worse for those early investigators, in 1986 there was no national fingerprint database accessible. The FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS, would only come online in July of 1999. So this meant that the bloody fingerprint was essentially an orphan clue, highly distinctive but useless without a database or a suspect for comparison. The lack of forced entry made detectives theorize that Margaret Ebby might have known her killer or voluntarily let him in. They scrutinized her personal life, looking for anyone with a potential grudge or dark fixation on her. The front page of the journal detailed one reason for this theory. A good friend of Margaret told police that Margaret had woken up several weeks before her murder to find a man in her bedroom. When she screamed, the man fled, but unfortunately, Margaret hadn't reported this incident to the authorities. Her friend thought that was because Margaret knew the man and didn't want to get him in any trouble. Perhaps it was this story that caused detectives to hone in on a man named Charlie Stone, a former medical student who was struggling with some mental health issues. Some reports suggested that Ebby and Stone had a strained acquaintance, possibly related to some funding for the Basically Bach Festival the previous year. When Flint detectives found out that Stone had been in town visiting family during the murder, they knew they needed to travel to Pennsylvania to question him. From the start, Stone's demeanor was strange, raising officers' suspicions. He vehemently denied any involvement, but investigators noted his anxiety. Stone agreed to take a polygraph test, and he passed, but this didn't clear him in the mind of the detective, so they also obtained hair samples from him to compare with any hairs that were found at the crime scene. The hairs, though, did not match what was collected at Ebby's home. In the end, despite Stone's odd behavior, there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime, and the investigators struggled to find other leads. Margaret Ebby's family was devastated by her loss. Her adult children, desperate for answers, even would hire a private investigator at their own expense. This PI re-interviewed neighbors, double-checked alibis of potential suspects, and even tailed Charlie Stone in Pennsylvania for several days. But just like the official investigation, the private one also yielded nothing solid. Months turned into years. The case went cold, haunting the family and local police with no resolution in sight. Then in 2001, a new national DNA database lit up with a match, linking the hotel slang to a murder no one had ever connected, and named a suspect investigators never had heard of. By 2001, 10 long years had passed since Nancy Ludwig's murder, and nearly 15 since Margaret Ebby's. Both cases sat in the cold case files of their respective police departments. However, in Wayne County, the site of Nancy's murder, the Cold Case Unit received a federal grant specifically to re-examine unsolved cases. This grant provided funding for overtime, new investigations, and crucially, forensic testing of preserved evidence with modern methods. If you've watched some of our other videos, this may sound familiar. It was a grant much like this that helped to solve Kimberly Louiselle's murder after 40 years. You can watch that story here. Nancy Ludwig's case file, with its carefully stored evidence, beckoned for another look. Investigators decided to submit the biological evidence from Nancy's case to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS. By 2001, CODIS had been fully implemented at a national level, meaning that DNA profiles could be compared all across the country. They got a lot more than they bargained for. The DNA profile from Nancy's murder matched another DNA profile in the CODIS system, the unsolved 1986 homicide of Margaret Eby, just as Mark Eby had suspected. This concrete connection was a huge breakthrough. It meant that a potential serial murderer had been operating in Michigan, spacing his crimes years apart, and until now, authorities didn't see the connection. Detectives from Detroit and Flint began working together, pooling their information. The modus operandi in both cases now made sense as a pattern. A woman alone, no forced entry, assaulted, throat slashed, and then most bizarrely, the killer calmly cleaning up after himself before leaving the scene. As Genesee prosecutor Arthur Bush said to the Ann Arbor News on August 19, 2001, quote, "The manner of death, there appears to be a certain signature to it. I'm confident the murders will be solved." End quote. With this new information, detectives in Flint pulled out Margaret Eby's old case file for a fresh examination. The bloody latent fingerprint from Eby's bathroom, which had sat in a binder for 15 years, was now able to be run through the FBI's database. By 2001, IAFIS had millions of prints digitized from across the country. This time, when the fingerprint from the Eby crime scene was searched, there was a match. The identity of Margaret Eby's killer, and thus Nancy Ludwig's killer, was now within reach. The fingerprint match pointed to a man named Jeffrey Wayne Gorton. When that name came up, the Michigan investigators were initially not familiar with it. Gorton had never been on the radar in either earlier investigations, but a deeper look into his background quickly illuminated how he came to be in the databases. In the late 1990s, Jeffrey Gorton had been convicted of a violent sexual assault in Key West, Florida, while he was serving in the Navy. And as a result of that conviction, his fingerprints and DNA profile were taken and eventually added to the nationwide databases. Gorton's unrelated crime and subsequent inclusion in the database had finally given the Phantom Killer a real identity. Investigators honed in, learning everything they could about Jeff Gorton. In 2001, he was a 38-year-old family man living in Bay City, Michigan, which wasn't far from Flint. He worked as a computer technician at a local hospital and was married with 2 children. To neighbors and acquaintances, Gorton seemed like an ordinary, upstanding citizen. The kind of guy who mowed his own lawn, went to his kids' school events, and blended into suburban life. However, subtle clues started to click together for the detectives. At the time of Margaret Eby's murder, Gorton had been working for his family's lawn care and gardening business, which had been hired by Applewood Estate, where Margaret rented the gatehouse, several days before the murder. While this proved Gorton had the opportunity to plan the murder, it also unfortunately offered a plausible alternative for the bloody fingerprint in the bathroom. The detectives knew that a good defense lawyer could argue that the bloody fingerprint was a coincidence. Gorton could have injured himself while working in the lawn and used Margaret's bathroom to clean the wound. So detectives kept searching for connections. Remember the twine we talked about that was used to bind Nancy's hands? It was the kind commonly used in gardening. Gorton had worked for years in his family's gardening and landscaping business, which gave him easy access to that kind of twine. Finally, they compared older photos of Gorton with a sketch of the man witnesses remembered in the hotel parking lot after Nancy Ludwig's murder. With the mounting evidence, Wayne County and Flint authorities were confident that Gorton was their man, but if they wanted a conviction, they had to move carefully. They needed to obtain their own fresh DNA sample from Gorton to conclusively tie him to both crimes in court. They also wanted to surveil him for a bit to see if he'd lead them to any further evidence or reveal any suspicious behavior. Teams were set up to quietly watch Gorton's movements. He was living in Bay City, so investigators from multiple jurisdictions coordinated to tail him without tipping him off. During this time, they also obtained a warrant to surreptitiously collect items he discarded. Weeks went by as they waited for the right opportunity. That opportunity came at a local roller skating rink during a school event. Jeff Gorton, looking like a normal dad, took his children to the school-sponsored skating night. He laughed with other parents, helped his kids lace up their skates, and maybe even shared snacks with them. Undercover officers were in the crowd, watching his every move from a discreet distance. They needed Gorton to discard something with his saliva on it. A used cup, a cigarette butt, anything of that nature. Finally, Gorton wiped pizza sauce off his mouth with a paper napkin, then casually tossed the napkin into a trash can. So as soon as Gorton stepped away, investigators moved in and retrieved the thrown-away napkin. It was exactly what they needed, an item saturated with Gorton's saliva. The napkin was rushed to the state crime lab for analysis. Technicians extracted DNA from Gorton's saliva on the napkin and compared it to the DNA profiles from Nancy Ludwig and Margaret Ebby's murders. The result was the final nail in the coffin. Jeffrey Gorton's DNA profile matched perfectly. This independent sample, collected legally and directly from Gorton without his knowledge, confirmed exactly what CODIS and the fingerprint had indicated. Now the investigators had a rock-solid case. Gorton was the man who'd been in room 237 with Nancy and in Margaret Ebby's home in 1986. So now authorities moved in to make an arrest. In February of 2002, almost exactly 11 years after Nancy's murder, Jeffrey Gorton was arrested at his home in Vienna Township. News of the arrest reverberated through the community and among the families of the victims. After so many years, the name and face of the killer was finally known. Nancy Ludwig's husband, Art, upon hearing that Gorton was arrested, said that it was the best phone call he'd ever received. After 11 years of waiting, relief came in with a flood of tears. Jeffrey Gorton was first charged in Wayne County for the murder of Nancy Ludwig. The indictment included charges of first-degree murder and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. Gorton's case went to trial in 2002, more than a decade after the crime. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the likely scenario of how Gorton had carried out the attack on Nancy at the airport Hilton. They suggested that Gorton had stolen a master keycard from the Hilton on a prior occasion. Records proved that Gorton had actually stayed at that hotel some time before Nancy's murder, so it's possible during that visit he found a way to take a copy of a staff key. Armed with a way to access any room, Gorton targeted a lone woman. Nancy, unfortunately, fit his profile of opportunity. A woman, traveling alone, arriving late, likely exhausted and off her guard. Prosecution theorized that Gorton let himself into her room while she was still checking in at the front desk, or while she was in transit from the lobby, so he laid in wait in the darkness until Nancy entered. Evidence presented to the jury solidly linked Gorton to the crime. The DNA evidence was front and center. Experts testified that the biological material found on Nancy's body and in the hotel room matched Gorton's unique genetic profile. The odds of anyone else having the same profile was astronomically small. Jurors learned that this same DNA was connected to the Flint murder as well, showing a pattern. Additionally, the prosecution presented the fingerprint match from the Margaret Ebby case, the bloody print from 1986 that matched Gorton's right index finger, which reinforced that he was involved in both crimes. Investigators also testified about additional incriminating findings. When Gorton was arrested, police executed a search warrant on his home and property. What they found was startling and disturbing. Gorton's house contained a hidden stash, approximately 800 pairs of ladies' underwear, many of them tagged or labeled with dates and locations. This suggested that Gorton had been engaging in criminal behavior for a long time, possibly breaking into homes or hotel rooms to steal underwear as trophies. Prosecutors highlighted this discovery to show that Gorton wasn't some one-time offender. He was a serial predator with a compulsion that likely provided him a strong motive. In fact, the investigators were open about the fact that they continued to hunt for any additional crimes where DNA might be connected to Gorton. There were also other pieces of evidence pointing to Gorton's guilt. Detectives noted that Gorton owned a gold Monte Carlo, similar to the one reported at the Detroit hotel around the time of Nancy's murder. And while Gorton had tried to meticulously clean Nancy's hotel room, investigators were able to find a few hairs in the bathroom sink, which forensic analysts said could have come from Gorton, likely shed as he washed up. Even though such hair evidence was not as conclusive as DNA, it provided another small bit of reinforcement of Gorton's guilt in the minds of the jury. Jeffrey Gorton's defense had little to work with in the face of this mountain of evidence. Gorton himself didn't even take the stand. After a gripping trial, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Quote, "Man guilty in 1991 killing," end quote, was the headline of the August 23, 2002 issue of the Detroit Free Press. Jeffrey Gorton had been convicted of Nancy Ludwig's assault and murder. The judge imposed the only sentence allowed for first-degree murder in Michigan, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Nancy's family, especially her husband Art, this was a moment of both sorrow and relief. Sorrow that nothing could bring Nancy back, but relief that the man responsible would never walk free again. With the conviction in the Ludwig case secured, authorities turned their attention to charging Gorton with Margaret Ebby's murder in Genesee County. In that case, seeing the outcome of the first trial and confronted with incontrovertible evidence, again the DNA link and the fingerprint on the faucet, Gorton chose not to go through another full jury trial. He pled no contest to all charges. A no contest plea, in essence, accepts the conviction without an admission of guilt. It's often used by defendants when the evidence is overwhelming, but they don't want to formally say, "I did it." In early 2003, Gorton was formally convicted for Ebby's murder as well. Again, received a sentence of life in prison without parole to be served in Michigan's prison system. In the courtroom, members of Margaret Ebby's family were present to see the justice done. 15 years of uncertainty await on them. Now they knew who killed their mother and why he hadn't been caught sooner. They also learned, to their horror, that her killer had remained free to kill again 5 years later. However, there was some solace in knowing that, at last, he was being held accountable. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton remains in prison in Michigan serving out his life sentences. He was initially housed at the Richard A. Handlin Correctional Facility and later moved to another facility with no chance of ever being released. The resolution of these cases provided long-awaited answers to the victims' families. Art Ludwig had spent a decade haunted by the image of what happened to his wife in that hotel room, agonizing over who could have done it. The Ludwig family had to move forward without Nancy, and every year that passed with the case unresolved was a year that compounded their grief with frustration. When Gorton was convicted, Art told reporters he finally felt he could close that chapter and remember Nancy without the cloud of unanswered questions. Margaret Ebby's children, too, had been tormented by the unknown. They dutifully kept their mother's memory alive, even establishing scholarships in her name at the university, yet always wondering if the villain who robbed them of her would ever be found. With Gorton's conviction, they were finally able to put a name and a face to the shadow that had hung over their lives. They even met with Nancy's family, finding a tragic kinship in the fact that their loved ones had suffered at the hands of the same man. The two families, once strangers, were brought together by the investigative threads that united the cases. In court statements, they voiced relief that Gorton would never hurt anyone else's mother, wife, or daughter ever again. Jeffrey Gorton's crimes also left a legacy in how we understand serial offenders. He didn't fit the stereotypical profile that many might expect. He wasn't a drifter or a visibly deranged loner. He was a family man, employed with a home and children. He'd served in the military and hid in plain sight for years. His ability to compartmentalize a normal public life with such horrific secret crimes is a stark reminder that serial predators can be outwardly ordinary. Psychologically, Gorton demonstrated traits in the worst kind of sexual killers: extreme violence and evidence of paraphilias, like the massive collection of underwear suggests trophy keeping. He also showed patience and planning, attacking in 1986 and then seemingly lying low for years before striking again in 1991. Investigators suspect he might have attacked other women non-fatally in between those years. Indeed, after his arrest, police in Michigan and elsewhere re-examined unsolved cases to see if they could link Gorton, especially to any crimes around 1986 to 1991 with a similar MO. At the time of this episode, no additional murders have been attributed to him, but given the scope of his trophy collection, it's quite possible he was a serial predator or burglar who flew under the radar for a very long time. For the Hilton Hotel near the Detroit airport, now operating under a different name, the story of Nancy's murder became something of a dark lore. Staff who were there in 1991 never forgot what happened in room 237. It's said that in the years after, flight crews would sometimes request not to stay on the third floor, and eventually the hotel underwent renovations and rebranding, though officially for business reasons, not because of the crime. Still, the tale of a killer lurking in a hotel room remains a cautionary legend for travelers and hotel workers alike. Thank you for watching this case. If you feel like we've earned it, please like and subscribe the channel so you'll be in the loop for future episodes, and thank you for watching.